Today we have back with us by popular demand, local historian Jared Marlowe. Jared is a graduate of VMI, a member of the Colonel George Waller chapter of the Sons of the American Revolution, a consultant for the Blue and Gray Education Society, and he is the chairman for the local 250th Anniversary Committee. Jared is a history buff and is extremely enthusiastic about what he learns in his research and can share with others. In his spare time, he writes a column entitled Community Chronicles for the Henry County Enterprise and has a video series on YouTube called History in Sight, which he produces along with Andy Doss. He has taken a huge interest in the Bassett Historical Center and supports our mission of preserving history. We always enjoy when he stops by for a visit, and today he has promised to put the fun in funeral. Okay, Jared, it's all yours.
All right, good morning.
Good morning.
Can everybody hear me? Good.
Right.
All righty. Well, I want to first say thank you so much for coming out today. It truly is an honor to be able to present this. I've been working on this for quite a while now, and this is the first time it has ever been talked about publicly before, by me. So you all are my test guinea pigs for this, but I truly thank you all for coming out today, and thank you to the Bassett Historical Center for hosting this event and for doing many events like this. Now, how many of you here, this is your first time at the Bassett Historical Center? Okay, a couple of you. My challenge to you all is today, before you leave, just walk around. Just see what's on the walls here. You don't have to do any research or pull any files or anything. Just spend some time looking at what all they have here, because this is truly an underappreciated gem in the community. But today's topic is a little bit off the beaten path of history. We're not here to talk about any wars or any politicians or any anything that happened locally per se. But we are going to talk about one aspect of history that impacts every single person in this room. You see, I'm not from this area originally. I'm from Danville, so I don't really have the tie into factory history like some of you do, and some of y'all don't have the tie into Danville's history like I do. So this topic is one that is going to hit us all one day, whether we like it or not. So I've titled today, Laying the Past to Rest, History of Funeral Tradition and Local Funeral History, because I know some of you, like me, are interested in what happened here locally. I know I said we want a local history presentation, but what happened here locally as far as the history of the funeral homes and how far that dates back. But primarily we're going to talk about how funeral traditions evolved from the beginning of time, really, but more specifically in the last 150, 160 years, because we truly see the birth of the modern American funeral in the last 160 years. So before we get started, do we have any licensed funeral directors in the house? Awesome. So you all probably won't know the answer to these two questions. So 2 trivia questions before we get started, because I'm going to use these terms a lot, and even though the American language uses them now interchangeably, they are vastly different. So does anybody know the difference between a casket and a coffin? Anybody? All right,
the shape of it.
Correct. A coffin is more body shaped. So think of it wider at the shoulders and narrow at their feet, whereas a casket is just a straight up rectangle. All right, does anybody know the difference between a cemetery and a graveyard?
Cemetery is usually church or graveyard.
Switch, yes. A graveyard is always attached to a church, whereas a cemetery is just a burial ground. But a graveyard, think of it as always being attached to a church. Now, like I said, we use them interchangeably in our language, but there is a difference. So I'm going to use all 4 of those terms going forward. I just wanted you to know the difference as to why I'm saying which one at a certain time. So if you're like the dozens of people I've talked to about this, they've always asked me this question: why are we talking about this today? What got me interested in the topic of death and funerals? Well, I think all of us have a morbid curiosity We're all curious about the next steps of life, or what happens when we die. But the true root of this for me goes back about 4 years. My wife and I were looking for things to do, and my mother lives down in the Cowens area, so we would take our oldest daughter and drop her off for some Nana time. And my wife and I would go down to Chatham, and we would go get coffee at the local coffee shop and go to this little hole-in-the-wall bookstore there on Main Street, Chatham. And right across the street from the coffee shop is the Simpson Funeral Museum. And it opened when I was in college, so I had heard of it, but I didn't really know anything about it. And my wife has always been one who's been fascinated by the dark and mysterious and spooky things, and I'm not. I pretty much stick to history and the things that truly happened. Wars, politics, stuff like that. But she made the comment that she would like to visit there one day. So being the good husband that I try to be, I set up a time and I talked to Scott Simpson, who runs it. Scott is from Chatham, but he lives down in Burlington, North Carolina, where he runs Mastercraft Casket Company. But he and his father opened this museum in Chatham to show the history of funerals, how they evolved, and he has a lot of priceless artifacts in there that deal with funeral history. And I went in there very hesitant. I expected it to be a very dark and gloomy tour and talking about death and eerie things, and it just wasn't me. I was dreading it. And then after spending a couple hours in there, I was fascinated. I was hooked, and I have gone back 4 or 5 times since. So if you're ever in Chatham and this place is open, please stop by and just walk around. You'll be truly surprised by what you find in there. And here's a picture from this year, actually. They had the largest collection of Fisk iron coffins that were ever displayed in the same room ever. So they have fun exhibits every so often, and they always have a constantly changing inventory. So every time you go in there, you'll see something you didn't know. And on the last slide, I'll show you their most recent edition. So be sure to ask about that once we get there. But in the Simpson Museum, if you go to the very back right corner, there's a banner on the wall that has this quote. It's by Sir William Gladstone, who was a 4-time Prime Minister of the UK. And this is not meant to get political or make a statement, but I do think there's a lot of truth and sincerity in this quote. It says, "Show me the manner in which a nation or community cares for its dead, and I will measure with mathematical exactness the tender sympathies of its people, their respect for the laws of the land, and their loyalty to high ideals." Basically, show me how a nation values its dead, and I'll show you the health of the nation. I think it's fair to say within the last couple decades or so, the emphasis and the respect for the dead has declined, and you can, if you want to say the values of our nation have declined or things aren't the same as they were 20, 30 years ago, according to Gladstone, those two things are correlated. But that really stuck with me, and I thought I'd share that with you all to start today. Now, some of you in here have heard me talk before, and it's probably been something Civil War related. And if you came here today expecting to hear Civil War stuff, you're in luck, because I'm about to talk Civil War for a little bit. Now, if you're here expecting, oh gosh, she's going to talk Civil War again, just give me like 4 or 5 minutes, and then we will move on. But to me, the root of the modern American funeral gets its start in the American Civil War with this guy right here. This is Colonel Elmer Ephraim Ellsworth. He is a young man from Mechanicsville, New York. And when Abraham Lincoln calls together the troops to put down the rebellion in the southern states, he and many of his friends from New York sign up to join. Ellsworth is very noted in the community, although he is very young, because at one time Ellsworth was a law clerk for President Abraham Lincoln. So Ellsworth signs up to join, and he and his company, the 11th New York, have been moved from New York down to Washington, D.C., and they're kind of just hanging around waiting to see what the southern states are going to do. On May 23rd, 1861, Virginia declares its secession from the United States and becomes part of the Confederate States of America, one of the last southern states to do so. When that happens, there's a group of people in Arlington who are very ardent secessionists. One of them is a guy by the name of James Jackson, who is the innkeeper for the Marshall House in Arlington. And when Virginia declares its secession, Jackson puts together a makeshift Confederate flag and then goes up to the roof, and it's kind of hard to see here, but there's a flagpole right there. He takes down the Union flag and puts up the Confederate flag and flies it high above, and you can see how high that flagpole would have been. Well, that Confederate flag was visible by, looking through binoculars from Washington, D.C. So Ellsworth gets it in his head that seeing a Confederate flag from the nation's capital is not going to stand. So what he and his men do is they ride across the Potomac, and they march on the Marshall House. They go in and they go up the stairs, and Ellsworth climbs up to the roof, takes down the flag, and heads back down the stairs. While all this is going on, James Jackson is sleeping in his room there. And one of the workers there goes and wakes him up and says, "The Union Army is here and they're taking down your flag." Jackson basically says, "Over my dead body." And he goes and he grabs his shotgun, and he meets Ellsworth coming down the stairs, and he puts the barrel up against Ellsworth's chest and blows a hole right in his left side, and Ellsworth is dead before he hits the ground. And this is a picture of Ellsworth's jacket. And that was a shotgun blast, and you can see there's not much spray there, so you can see how close the barrel truly was. So Ellsworth falls dead. One of Ellsworth's men, Private Francis Brownell, then shoots Jackson with his musket and then bayonets him to the wall so he can't escape, as if he wasn't dead already. And this is significant because, and that's Brownell right there, Brownell would go on to later receive a Congressional Medal of Honor for this act. And even though he was not the first Medal of Honor given, his actions make him the first, heroic actions of the war to merit a Medal of Honor. So that comes from this event. Now, word of this event travels quickly back across the Potomac to the nation's capital, and people are in a panic and frenzy because now, the war has come just across the river from them, and this is an act of aggression by the southern states. But word particularly falls to a guy by the name of Dr. Thomas Holmes. Holmes is in D.C. at the time, and he is practicing a new form of preserving the dead called embalming, in which he takes all these chemicals, mixes them together, puts them in the body, and it's able to preserve the body. He hears what's happened, and Holmes is very good friends with Secretary of State William Seward. Holmes goes to Seward and says, "I need an audience with the president right now because I know how important Ellsworth was to the Lincoln family. And I have a way that we can both honor Ellsworth and help out Ellsworth's family, who would later find out about Ellsworth's death through a telegraph." So he goes and he schedules a meeting with Lincoln, and Holmes comes to the meeting and tells Lincoln, "I have a way that's we can preserve the body and get Ellsworth back to his home state of New York, where his family will be able to see him one last time, and we can show our respects to one of the true first fallen soldiers of this conflict." Lincoln is a bit hesitant because embalming is brand new, and he knew Ellsworth on a very personal level, and he was unsure about pumping this man full of chemicals and what it would do. But he says, "You know what? If this is proven and you can do it, you can have Ellsworth's body." So Holmes takes Ellsworth's body back across the Potomac, and they go to one of the firehouses in D.C., and Holmes embalms Ellsworth. And it's particularly significant they do it in a firehouse because the 11th New York were a bunch of firemen in New York. So that's why they chose the firehouse to do it in. So Holmes preserves the body and then takes the body to the White House, where it lies in state. It's one of the first bodies to ever truly lie in state that wasn't a political figure in the White House. And over the course of 24 hours, it's visited by hundreds of military and civilian political personnel, different people passing through to pay their respects to Ellsworth. Again, many of them knew him personally because of his connections. One particular person to visit was Mary Todd Lincoln. She made the remark to her husband that it looked like Ellsworth was, quote, just sleeping. This is going to be important here in a few minutes. So after he lays in state for a day, Ellsworth's body is then put on a train and then shipped back to Mechanicsville, New York, where he is buried in the Ellsworth family plot. Now, this may seem like a pretty mundane story to you all, or like, oh, that's neat. But for 1860s, this was radical. Because most every death back then, they just kind of buried you where you were. This is one of the first instances of people transporting bodies to be buried somewhere else that wasn't too far from where they were. We'll come back to this in a second. Let's talk about the history of funerals, though. And you can't talk about the history of funerals without talking about the ancient Egyptians. The Egyptians were the most noted for their mummification form. So what they would do is they would essentially take all the organs out of your body, drain your body of blood, dehydrate it in salt, and then put a salve on it, wrap it, and then put it in a sarcophagus. Yeah, we were talking about that earlier, trying to sound official, sarcophagus. And the more noted you were in society, the more fancy your sarcophagus was, which is, you all have probably seen the pictures of King Tut's sarcophagus with the gold inlays and stuff. If you're an average person, they just, wrapped you up and kind of just left you there, or they put you in the ground somewhere. Now, the Egyptians mummified everything. They mummified cats, dogs, flowers. I don't know how they did that, but they figured out a way. We found mummified flowers in the pyramids. But the Egyptians were not the only ones to practice some kind of mummification or some kind of preserving the dead. Here are a few other societies in early history that did practice some kind of mummification or some kind of preservation of deceased bodies. So the Incas would put them in frozen mountain caves where the body would just be frozen, and that would stop the decomposition process. The Chinese would actually bury theirs in the desert. And if you know anything about decomposition, the two things that are needed for decomposition are air and water. And if you take water out of the equation, being in a desert, it slows decomposition drastically. But my favorite is the Anga from Papua New Guinea. They would essentially smoke the bodies and then put them in kind of a protective clay wrapping and then put them in scaffolds that would overlook the village. So talking about having your ancestors look down on you, literally. So just kind of neat. But this just goes to show you that the Egyptians were not the only ones to do this. It was going on all around the world. Just they get the most noted for it because they're probably the most elaborate, and we have the most signs of it today with the pyramids and such. But one thing we see even from an early onset of human civilization is when people die, they tend to get buried together. We see it in the form of like burial mounds, if you've ever seen a burial mound before, or catacombs and crypts beneath cities. This is a picture from one of the catacombs beneath Paris, which has over 6 million different bones in it. Or we just see different family cemeteries, especially when we get into the last several hundred years, families being buried together. Now, there's a reason why people are buried together, and it may seem like common sense today, but there's a reason that people just aren't buried where they drop dead and then you move on. One aspect is financial. If you drop dead on somebody else's land, you probably didn't want to pay them to get buried there. It's nice if you have a family plot or an area that's designated in your town or your village or your community for the deceased, to just put them there. It's probably easier to do. And so if you picked up and moved your houses, you'd have to exhume your dead bodies and then move them along with you. Probably the more common reason, though, is a sense of family or community. So people wanted to be buried with their family or a sense of community because they didn't want to be alone. They want to be surrounded by loved ones, both in life and then in death. So we start to see families being buried together, or different people in the community being buried together in one central spot, just for that sense of being together even after one is deceased. But the more common one that we see in areas like this is for religious nature. Now, if you ever go to an old cemetery, and Ivan here has probably visited a lot of old cemeteries. This is Ivan right here. He's a good friend of mine. Ivan can probably tell you that most of your old cemeteries face east-west. That's because it is said that, or in the Bible, that when Jesus comes back, he's going to come in the eastern sky. So all the graves wanted to be facing east, so the bodies can raise and meet Jesus when he comes back. So if you're ever in an older cemetery, take out a compass or whatever. I think every iPhone or phone has a compass now, and look at the direction that bodies are buried. Now that's not a golden rule, but it's a pretty safe rule. What you say?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, most cemeteries face east-west. Also, a lot of old houses face east-west too, but that's for a different reason. Now, we could spend all day talking about early funeral traditions from thousands of years ago, and that's a whole separate presentation. This is actually 2 presentations put into one, by the way. So if you want me to give this one or 2 different other ones, hey, talk to me afterwards. But we're going to talk about early American funerals here today. And we're going to start out in the early colonial times, 1700s. And what you see is when somebody passes away, typically they are buried within 24 hours. They didn't have a way back then to stop decomposition, so the body would immediately start to break down. You have bacteria and things inside your stomach that eventually will start eating away at your body, and that's how decomposition starts. So typically within 24 hours, you were in the ground and they have moved on. Now, when people started to settle this country, they were breaking away, a lot of them, from the Catholic Church or the Anglican Church. They were doing their own thing. So we have people like Quakers, Puritans, and the Pilgrims. They were very strict religious people. So a lot of the early funerals were very much, we would say drab. Not a lot of pomp and circumstance. They would put you in a box, put you in the ground. And funny enough, a lot of times funerals were a silent event. No words were said. If you had words spoken at your funeral, it showed that you were one of the higher people in society. So if you were a working class citizen, they would just put your body in the box, put it in the ground, and everybody would just stand there silently while they put the dirt back on, and that was it. You moved on about your day. If you had words spoken at your funeral, it showed that you were a higher person in society, and typically those words were in the form of some kind of conversion sermon from the local priest, warning you that if you didn't change your ways, you were going to be damned to hellfire and brimstone. So that's the early American funeral, and I love looking at old headstones like this, because that's truly a work of art, and you see a lot of that, especially like the New England area, typical stones like that. But as generations pass, they tend to break away from that rigid mold of just being so strict, so confining, so lack of emotion. And we start to see more and more elaborate celebrations for the dead. It's said that when Governor John Winthrop's grandson passed, he had a gun and cannon salute at his grave, where they went through 2 kegs of gunpowder. So it wasn't your typical 21 gun salute, but they were firing pretty hot and heavy. But that's one of the first ones that we see on record of not being just a procession, a silent procession followed by putting somebody in the ground and then moving on. And then traditions kept evolving. And the person you see there on the right is something that comes out of Dutch tradition, and that's called an aansprake. An aansprake was the first, what we would call a funeral director. So let's just say that you had a loved one die. You would take your time to grieve, and then you would go contact the local aansprake. Now, aansprake would then get a list of people who you wanted invited to your funeral, and then go door to door to invite them to the funeral. And if you attended the funeral and you weren't invited, that was a no-go. You were ostracized from society. So you would create a list of people who you wanted at grandma's funeral, and that was it. Those are the only people who were allowed to attend. Later, the aansprake would go and be in charge of making sure that the graves were dug and procuring a coffin, and this is where we see the funeral director role start to come out. And then we start to see little tokens and different mementos being associated with the dead. it's a common thing now for people to not necessarily collect, but keep funeral pamphlets. But back then, they would keep things like gloves. It's been said that in late 17th, early 18th century, you would set aside part of your estate to buy gloves for your funeral so you could hand them out. It became the hot item to own funeral gloves. So you would have collections of, oh, those gloves came from Jared's funeral. Those gloves came from Andy's funeral. And that was the thing just to hold on to. And the more gloves you had, the cooler you were in society. We also start to see metal coffins, metal sarcophaguses. So a sarcophagus would be just a box that they would put a body in and just put a lid on it. And then, of course, gun salutes early on in century. And that is actually a pair of 18th century funeral gloves that have survived. So there weren't anything elaborate. Of course, if somebody dies, you don't have time to make anything elaborate. But those would be passed out as tokens to the wanted people at funerals. And this went on, again, the 17th and most of the 18th century. But one of the true revolutions in funeral history came in the mid-1840s with a guy by the name of Almond Fisk. Almond Fisk was a cast iron stove maker, and Almond Fisk had a problem. His brother was traveling across the country and had died in one of the towns he was visiting. Well, back then that meant that when he died, he was buried in the town cemetery, and that was the end of it. Well, Fisk didn't like that too much. He wanted something that would prevent that from happening to other families. So using his knowledge of cast iron making, he makes what we now know as the Fisk iron coffin. So what he did was he took designs from ancient Egypt, and he crafted what we would call a sarcophagus, in which a body could be put into, and they would get rid of as much air as possible. So you would be crammed into this metal cast iron coffin, and they would seal it shut, therefore preventing further air from getting in, and there's no moisture in there, so it would drastically slow the decomposition process. So Fisk started making these iron coffins, and then within a few years he passes away, and the rights to it are sold to other cast iron makers, and we see for a few years the iron coffin being the hot item on the market. Now back then, an iron coffin, if it gets cut off here, would cost you roughly around $125. So that was a whole lot back then. But it was priceless because now you had a way that if your loved one passed away somewhere else, you could get them back home. You could get them to their family cemetery. This is the first time that we see people being able to move deceased bodies from place to place. Keep in mind, this is going with the advent of the railroad. So you could put one of these iron coffins on the rails and get them practically all over the country at this point. But this is truly revolutionary. But this is also kind of cut short because just 20 years or so after it was invented, metal gets rationed because of the Civil War. So we don't really see these take off in popularity like you think they would because metal starts getting rationed and the price of them just goes absolutely through the roof. And no one wants to carry around an iron coffin behind them just in case they pass away. Here are a few of those that are on display at the Simpson Funeral Museum. As you can see, they're very narrow, but that's because they have to be. They would cram the bodies in there, and they didn't want any airspace at all because that would allow for decomposition. But you see the facial shield there that you can take off. And then, of course, there's one for infants because that was a lot more common back then. But these are on display if you want to go see them. Like I said, very narrow. You look at them and you're like, no human being would ever fit in there. And they made it work. They had a lined or kind of a rubberish seal, or they would use hot tar to seal around it so no air could get in. And then they would bolt it down and screw it so it was secure. Moving on to embalming. Embalming has been around since the 1830s and 40s. This guy on the left, John Nicholas Ganal, was one of the first to practice embalming. He came up with and I'm not a chemist by any way, a aluminum acetate / sulfate combination that he would then put in bodies and it would preserve them. But the problem with that is the bodies would then start changing colors, and he wasn't really a fan of that. So he tinkered with his method some more, and he got a way that would slow decomposition drastically, but not all the way. So one day he was teaching in France, because those are obviously French names. He was teaching in France, and he gets challenged to an embalming contest by Jean-Pierre Suquet, one of his former students, who has perfected his own way of embalming using zinc chloride. So the men agreed to have a contest. They will embalm a body, and they will exhume it a year later to see how much it has decomposed, one versus the other. So the men do it, and then a year later, they come back, and Suquet's body looks exactly the way it did the day it was embalmed. Ganal's was very much preserved, but was starting to show signs of decay. Suquet's was perfectly intact the way that it was. So Suquet then starts to sell his formula for what we would now know as formaldehyde. And the way that you would start to embalm bodies, like in places like here locally, is you would buy the rights to Suquet's formula, and then you would take the chemicals and make them yourself. So kind of a dangerous thing, but that was the way they did it back then. So we start to see embalming come out in the 1830s and 40s. The first ones to do it here in America was a dentist in Manhattan named Charles Brown. Charles Brown is the one who instructed Dr. Thomas Holmes from before. So, like I said, this is embalming came around in the 1830s and 40s. By the time of the 1860s, it's starting to catch on a bit, and it catches on to the point where you start to have embalming doctors following Civil War camps around. And if you were a wealthy enough Civil War soldier, you would pay the doctor to, if you died in that battle, they would come embalm your body and ship it back. So we start to see these camp followers of embalmers in the Civil War. Now, this photo right here is kind of deceiving. There's only one deceased person in this photo. The other two just posed. The ones that are upright in the caskets, they are very much alive. So they back then, having your photo taken was a very rare opportunity, so they took advantage of it.
Yeah, can I keep the box?
right. Yeah, get a later discount on it. But this is truly when we start to see embalming take off is in the American Civil War, even though only 6% of all soldiers who died in the American Civil War were embalmed. So a very low percentage of the 650,000 casualties that occurred over the 4 years, only 6% of them get embalmed. But it's a strong possibility that if you go to a cemetery today and the body, there's a body buried there that the person died elsewhere or died in battle, and they're now buried in a family plot, you can either assume that they were either embalmed or they were shipped back home using a Fisk iron casket, or they were later reinterred. The naive person in me likes to think, oh, this person was embalmed or this person's in an iron coffin. But the Civil War, though, is truly when we start to see this take off. Now let's go back to our story from earlier. So 1861, Ellsworth dies. He's embalmed, and he's shipped back home to New York. Less than a year later, Abraham Lincoln and Mary Todd have a son pass away named Willie. Well, as any grieving mother, as a grieving mother goes through that process, she wants to hang on to her kid as long as possible. So they have young Willie embalmed so that Mary Todd can spend more time with her son before he is then buried. So Willie Lincoln is embalmed, one of the first citizens to go through this process. And obviously once the Lincolns do it, it's starting to really catch on then. And then more famously, when Abraham Lincoln is shot in 1865, his body is embalmed. And we know this because, have you all heard of the Lincoln funeral train before? When Lincoln was assassinated, his body was embalmed, not by Holmes, because Holmes was, I can't find the correct source for this. Some people say that he was dead by 1865. Others say that he's following the Civil War camps around. But Lincoln was embalmed, and then they put his body on a train, and then carried it back to Springfield, Illinois, but they made stops every so often where the public could come and view Lincoln's body, and there's no way that would have been possible without embalming. So Lincoln was lying in state, perfectly preserved because of embalming. But with Lincoln's death, we truly see what we would now know as the modern American funeral. And this is what I mean by that. The community, the whole entire community, in this case, the nation, was notified of a death and that they could come view the body. There was a public viewing of the body. You didn't have to schedule a time. It was on the train. You would come up and get to pay your respects in person. He had a religious funeral service. There was a sermon preached at Abe Lincoln's funeral. Transportation to the grave for burial. He was killed in D.C. and he is later buried in Illinois. So we see a transportation to or from a death site to a burial site, and we start to see permanent monuments to him. So you see aspects of some of those all throughout history, but this is one of the first times in history that we see all those aspects coming together in what we would now know as a funeral, with like putting the obituary in the newspaper, setting up times for visitation, having a religious funeral where a preacher leads the service. This is truly where we see the first instance of that is with Lincoln's death. So as embalming is progressing and we start to see the funeral industry take off, local businesses start to buy in on it. We don't see as soon as the Civil War is over, we don't see Smith Funeral Home pop up. We don't see, the funeral industry by itself happen. And we start to see local businesses that are already there taking on that role of undertaking. They would be the ones who would buy the formula, make the coffins, because caskets are a fairly recent thing, and we'll get into that in a little bit. But we start to see local businesses like this local reference here, Craig and Bassett. You see general merchandise, and then undertakers. Local businesses who are already established take on the role of then taking care of the dead. So they would care for you in life, and they would care for you in death. So after the death of a loved one, you would call these local businesses, so C.C. Bassett Undertaking, Craig and Bassett Undertakers, you would call them to notify them that, or let them know that you had a death in the family. The undertaker would bring his tools and a casket or a coffin out with him. He would then prepare the body. Now, keep in mind, only about 25% of bodies were embalmed as late as 1934. So what does prepare the body mean? Well, your undertaker would wash the body and get it dressed, make sure the eyes were closed, sew the lips shut, make sure the body was perfectly preserved. A lot of times that they would bring with them an ice casket, which is essentially a huge ice chest that you would put a body in to help preserve it. And the body was laid for display in the parlor of the home, which is where we get the term funeral parlor, because it was displayed in the parlor of the home. And then shortly after the wake at the home, the body would then be moved to a family plot for burial. But here we see a picture of a traditional home funeral. This took place in the living room, the parlor of the home, and that was the standard from late 19th century on up through the kind of the middle 20th century. I talked to Bill Collins Jr. For a while when I was doing my research, and he said that his dad in the 1930s and 40s, Big Bill Collins, was still doing home funerals at that time in the 30s and 40s. So this was the model that was followed up until the last 100 years or so. This is what was known as a jack-in-the-box setup. So it's kind of hard to see, but over to the right here, there's a suitcase. And inside that suitcase fit all of this. You had a drapery set up. You had a collapsible cot that would fit in there. And the undertaker would just take this jack-in-the-box out and bring it to your home, set everything up, and they would lay the body there for viewing. So this was a portable setup. And then after burial, they would take it all down, put it back in the suitcase, and then bring it back. So that's what it's called, a jack-in-the-box setup. And then there's another example of a home burial, but you can clearly see it's the home with family photos on the wall. Again, that was the standard, that your parlor, your living room was the place where the service happened. And then there's a picture of an ice chest casket. So they would take ice and put it in this top tray right here, and then have the body below it, because cold air sinks and it would keep the body cold. There's a little viewing window right there for display, and this is at the Simpson Funeral Museum if you want to see it. And on the back side of that is a drain, because obviously the ice would melt. But this is an ice chest casket, or this is a casket. A way that you could display the body for longer if you had access to ice. This is an older embalming table. This would be portable, or could be portable, but a lot of times, especially with their heavier cast iron ones like this, they would keep them in the place of business. As you can see, it sits at an angle with the bucket below it. That back there is a motor that they would use to push in the embalming fluid and push out the blood. And a lot of times too, they would either use the motor, or if they didn't have access to it, they would use like an IV system, like a gravity method, to push fluids in and out. There's old bottles of embalming fluid, and I've got a couple up here now on display that date back to the 40s, and I'll gladly tell you about them afterwards. If you were rich and fancy, you took your last ride in the horse-drawn hearse. This is the first hearses that we see, an enclosed carriage, glass on either side, driven by the undertaker, and people could view the casket as it rode by them. This is a casket or a hearse that's on display at the Simpson Funeral Museum. This is a 95% original hearse that dates back to the 1870s. This was actually the one that was in Chatham for years. The only thing that's been refurbished is the seat and those little plumes up there. Other than that, totally original. And right here, I want to take a second to talk about why we see even to this day African American funeral homes and Caucasian funeral homes, white funeral homes. It was during this era that we see those businesses start to separate. Now we see funeral homes today taking care of everybody, and that's the way it should be. But back then, the white people did not want to touch a deceased black body. So we see the black funeral industry start to take off, because that was the one industry that was not going to be interfered with by white people. And that is why to this day we have pretty much separate black funeral homes and white funeral homes. It goes back to this. And also, African Americans have different culture when it comes to burials and traditions than most white people do. So, but main point is we see the bifurcation of the industry in this era. So here's some cool photos I thought y'all would enjoy. This is a bill for buying three caskets in 1906, and you could buy 3 caskets: one for somebody who was 5'9", one for somebody who was 6 foot, one for somebody who was 6'3", for the low price of $44. If you've ever bought a casket recently, you know that it's not $11 or $11 or $12, but back then each casket or coffin was $11. And this is a funeral bill from 1919. So we see purchase of the casket, purchase of embalming, hearse, grave opening and closing, and it gets cut off there, but the price is $250. So full service funeral, $250. Kind of different today, isn't it? This is an old sign from that's found in the Simpson Funeral Museum. Where the museum sits was actually the old Chatham Furniture Building, and it was then known as Chatham Furniture and Undertaking. So when you go to the museum, you're actually going to the building that served as the Chatham's Furniture Store, and upstairs was the Undertakers. And then here's a bill of sale from Craig and Bassett from 1945, and the full service funeral cost $495. And so pretty interesting how times have changed. So the evolution of the modern funeral, we start to see enclosed burial vaults, or they were invented in 1912. Prior to that, you would have possibly a grave liner. The difference between a liner and a vault is a liner supports the soil, a vault keeps out things. So a liner is just there to keep the ground from collapsing on itself, whereas a vault will keep out rainwater and all sorts of critters and worms and stuff. We see vaults invented in 1912. And caskets become more commonly used around the turn of the century. Caskets are a lot easier to produce. If you've ever seen a wooden coffin, that's a hard thing to make because you have to curve the wood and get the exact shape, get the person's height exactly right to fit in it perfectly. Whereas I was talking to, like I said, Scott Simpson, who makes these for a living. You would make a metal casket almost like you would like a car fender. You would pour the metal into a mold, weld it at the corners, and that's about it. Caskets are a lot easier to produce, so which makes them cheaper and more affordable. But surprisingly, the United States is really the only country on earth that uses caskets. Most countries still use coffins, but for some reason Americans use caskets. And to me, it's more aesthetically pleasing, just a rectangle box as opposed to like a body-shaped box. But the true changing or true catalyst for the funeral industry happens when the car is invented. Because now the undertaker doesn't have to come to you and set up everything in your house. They can now transport bodies back and forth. So the funeral industry really takes off once the car is invented and is more commonly used. And we see undertakers go from catering to solely the dead to now catering to the living. Because now, not only can they come pick up your deceased person and bring them back to their place of business and do all the work there, but they can now transport you to a hospital. And we start to see the ambulance business rise at the same time as the funeral business. So imagine, you're out working somewhere and you fall and break your leg and you can't get to a hospital. You would call the local funeral service and they would bring out their hearse and strap you in the back and you would ride to the hospital in the hearse. And that's truly where we see the birth of the ambulance service. And I found this the other day, and it's pretty cool. This is from McKee back in the day, and how much they would charge you for an ambulance ride. So from Martinsville to Roanoke was $12. Martinsville to Danville, $7. They even would take you as far as Richmond or Stanton or Charlottesville. So can you imagine riding in the back of a hearse on a gurney for that long? So there's actually a couple of these. There's one in this room and there's one over there. But we see funeral homes start putting their advertisements on everything. We got fans, ashtrays, magnets, calendars, because if they were the ambulance service, you wanted to have that number pretty close by. In case something were to happen, you wouldn't have to look for it. So we see them put their phone numbers everywhere. We got day phone, night phone. Again, advertisements everywhere. And a lot of you probably remember having funeral home calendars or funeral home like that ashtrays, because they wanted you to have that number handy in case you needed them for anything. And I thought that's pretty cool. That was back when FDR was president. Like, that was the modern thing, was putting him as there. And that's actually on the back side of that wall back there if you want to go look at it. All right, cremation. Cremation has always been a thing. If you think back to the old Viking days, the Viking funeral with the funeral pyre and burning the body, cremation has always existed. But for a while, it kind of got a bad rep, and I'm not 100% sure why. Maybe it just became viewed as a way to, you were mutilating the body or getting rid of the body, and the body couldn't rise from the grave afterwards. But cremation starts to really come back into focus in the mid-19th century, and towards the end of the 19th century, we see crematories pop up all over Europe first. This is the Woking crematory in England. It's the first crematory that's built to be a crematory and not just a large oven. And this dates back to 1870. But where cremation started to take their huge rise is in the 1960s. The Catholic Church allows those who are deceased to be cremated. And after that, and after it becomes acceptable by the Catholic Church, we start to see the cremation rates just go through the roof. And there's no doubt that you all have probably seen or experienced that locally with the changing of the times and over the decades. Full service funerals used to be the way that somebody would go, but now it's more common to have a celebration of life. So let's look at some cremation numbers across the United States. So as you see, in the early 19-teens, not a lot of crematories, not a lot of cremations. By the time we get to several years ago, there are 3,000 crematories. And again, this was pre-COVID, so that number has drastically gone up since COVID, but this is the most recent I could find. In 2019, 1.5 million cremations alone. Locally, it's a little bit different because this is a more smaller conservative community. In the 1950s, they were doing an average of about 10 cremations a year. 40 years later, it became about 10% of their business. So it's still a decent piece, but not the main thing. And then current times, it's about 25 to 30% of business, depending on which funeral home you ask. But if we go an hour up or an hour down the road, that number increases dramatically. In Roanoke, 60% of all deaths are in cremation, and in Greensboro, that number is 80%. But there are some cons to burial, and I don't want to think cremations are all bad. Have you ever thought about the logistics of a cemetery, though? If you have a 10-acre cemetery, you have enough wood in that 10-acre cemetery to frame 40 houses. There's 900 tons of casket metal, and there's 22,000 tons of vault concrete in just a 10-acre cemetery. And to put that in perspective, Roselawn is about 25 acres. So, and also every year, 800,000 gallons of embalming fluid are buried. So you're putting that stuff straight in the ground. So, I'm not saying that either way is wrong or right. I know it's a personal preference, but just wanted to put some numbers there for you. And cremations across the United States obviously are going to go up. That's the black line. I hate it gets cut off over here, but in the South, you see more traditional cremation rates, whereas like the Northwest and California are very high cremation rates. Even up in like Washington and Oregon, they eclipse 81% plus. Now let's get to what you all are probably here to talk about, local funeral history. So local funeral history, to me, I didn't think this would be as big of a thing as it was, but I pulled one thread and three different things came loose. So let's talk about the history of the funeral home in this area, both Henry County and Martinsville. And a lot of these events will probably be memories to you all because they happened within the last 40, 50 years. But hopefully you'll walk away from here having learned a little something. So the early history of the funeral industry in this area, in Martinsville, there was they called it the Martinsville Mortician School. And it sat in the second floor of what was then known as Stoltz and Shoemate Furniture, which later became the Eagles Building. So if you all remember where the Eagles Building was uptown, today it's the parking lot right there across from the courthouse. The second floor of that held the Martinsville Mortician School. So you could go to that school in Martinsville and learn to be a mortician. So that's where this photo is taken from. Again, hopefully there's fewer deceased bodies in that photo than we think. That was definitely not an actual thing. But that's the history of Martinsville. In Henry County, we see businesses like C.C. Bassett Furniture and Undertaking. This photo comes from the 19-teens. So again, the furniture industry was already there, furniture store was already there, and then we see C.C. Bassett, the brother of J.D., and then add the Undertaker label to his already existent business. So this building would have sat close to where like the Wells Fargo Bank building is now. Is that right, Andy? All right, first funeral home we're going to talk about is Craig and Bassett. Craig and Bassett starts as a general merchandise store. They add in the undertaking component of business in 1922 or 23. And I'm pretty sure they got that business from C.C. Bassett and just molded it into theirs. When C.C. Bassett gets out of the undertaking business, he sells the business to his brother's brother-in-law. I think that's how we figured it out, wasn't it? His brother's brother-in-law. So distant family connection. A guy by the name of Morton Coleman. Morton Coleman is the undertaker there at Craig and Bassett until probably the early to mid 30s. And then Craig and Bassett hires an undertaker by the name of William A. Collins, and that's him pictured right there. Big Bill Collins works for Craig and Bassett from 34 until 44. And here's an old Craig and Bassett ad where it's actually 300. We can get a metal casket and a metal vault, complete service funeral for $300. And then here's a picture of the Craig and Bassett store on Main Street, and then the upper room, the second floor, was where they would do the undertaking and have their caskets. So when Bill Collins leaves Craig and Bassett in 1944, he moves and starts his own business, but Craig and Bassett keeps the funeral business. But the funeral business has grown so much that they realize they can't do it on the second floor of their building anymore. So they purchase a home on the other side of the river and start their first separate funeral home there. And that's what this is. And this home no longer exists, but this is where the now former Carter Bank sits, just across the river, across from the Methodist Church. That was Craig and Bassett Funeral Home from 44 to 47. And then in 1940s, then they hire this guy named Marion Winley to replace Collins after he leaves in 44. And then in 47, they are bought by McKee from Martinsville. And Craig and Bassett ceases to exist in 1947. Because we see Pete Craig right there become a funeral director for McKee. McKee stays in Bassett just for a few years before they eventually phase out. So when Big Bill Collins moves out of Craig and Bassett, he moves into the former Philpott home right here on Main Street. And he establishes his residence there, top floor, and the funeral home in the bottom floor. And it's here that he starts Collins Funeral Home. And he operated out of that building for 20 some years. And then here's an ad for their ambulance service. So you could call them day or night, and they would escort you to a hospital in the back of one of their lovely fleet of hearses. Here's a bill from Collins in 1951. Full service funeral was actually $780, but the VA paid some of it. So $780. This ad is from 1962 when Collins moves to the home behind the service station, just off of Main Street. So Collins was where Bassett Funeral Home is for about 20 years. Then they move to, and back then it was called Church Street, and I forget the name of it today. But they were there, they moved there. Again, you can see the hearse / ambulances. And then they briefly operated in Collinsville on Wheeler Avenue, just for a period of years. So about a quarter mile down on the left was the Collins Funeral Home in Collinsville. In 1978, Collins builds their current place right across from Bassett High School, where they have been since 78. And there's Big Bill Collins and then his son, Bill Jr. In 1986, Bill Collins Jr. buys McKee Funeral Home, and then becomes Collins McKee in 86. And then later in, I think it's 1992, I think, Collins McKee gets bought out by the Lineberry Funeral Home. And Lineberry is out of Greensboro. So that's when the Collins sell the business, and those two funeral homes become operated by a larger company. Lineberry was buying up funeral homes all up and down the Mid-Atlantic region. McKee Funeral Home, though, Jim McKee starts out as an undertaker in the Stoltz and Shoemate building. It transitioned from the Martinsville Mortician School to the to Stoltz Shoemate Undertaking. He works there for a few years and then starts his own practice in 1935 on Broad Street, and that building is still there today. It's totally painted white now, but that's 29 Broad Street. That's the original McKee. And I put this picture in. This is a picture looking down from the balcony of the courthouse, and right in here would have been where Stoltz and Shoemate Furniture was. This is Bridge Street today, so this is where the parking lot is today. Then there's a later picture of it with the green roof and the green shutters. And then there's the ambulance schedule or pricing from Martinsville to all the different locations. So McKee moves into Bassett briefly from about 47 to I think around 1950. They were not here very long because Collins kind of had Bassett sewed up. So McKee moves back into Martinsville and focuses all their business in Martinsville. They build their current location further down Broad Street. I think it's 120 or 109 Broad Street, 29 then 109 Broad Street. Now, interesting fact about McKee building this funeral home in the 70s. When McKee built this funeral home in the 70s, it was the first time in this area that a business had built a funeral home that was solely for funerals. When Collins had his home, he and his family lived in the upstairs. When McKee and Mr. and Mrs. McKee were operating this, they lived up there. And then even when Collins moved to their new location in the 60s, in that White House behind the service station, they lived on the upper floor. This is the first time in this area that a building was solely built for funerals with a chapel. So that was in 74. And then later, McKee would be part of that larger conglomerate, which would later become Collins McKee Stone. There was for a brief time, a Smith Towns funeral home in Martinsville. This would have operated on Starling Avenue. From my best guess, it would be somewhere around where like the Church of Christ is on that part of Starling, the far end of it, right there in that curve. That's my best guesstimate because, as we know, street numbers and stuff change over time. But this is the old Smith and Towns funeral home, and at one time, briefly, they were Swicegood and Fox, and you can see that's the same building. But we do know that Smith came first. Then Stone Funeral Home originates in the 1950s. I think it's 56. They are just a house or two down from what was formerly Smith Towns and Swicegood and Fox. But Stone Funeral Home at 925 or 825 Starling Avenue operates out of that home, and then they would later build a different location just right next to it. But I think that's a cool picture, just with all the hearses sitting out front. Stone is sold to Lineberry, the same company that bought Collins McKee in 1996. And Lineberry shuts down Stone Funeral Home because there's no need to have three in this small area. So that's how we get the name Collins McKee Stone. It still honors the Stone legacy, but Stone Funeral Home, where it was, ceased to exist in about 30 years ago. Then back to Bassett here. When Bill Collins moves from Main Street to his second location, within a day or two, really, the Stone family from Martinsville opens up a second location here in Bassett. And they stay for a little bit longer, but then they eventually phase out of the funeral industry. Again, Collins has pretty much everything sewed up here. But then they kind of sell their business to the Mize family, and it becomes Bassett Mize for a while, and then Mize, Stone Mize, and then later it's bought by the Tomlinsons from over in Ridgeway, and it becomes Mize Tomlinson. But it's that same core business that existed back in the 60s when Collins moved out. Back over to Martinsville with the African American funeral homes. The first African American funeral home we see is Watkins Funeral Home. Reverend George P. Watkins was an undertaker and a local preacher who would embalm bodies in his home, and he later bought space on Fayette and opened up the first funeral home there, Watkins Funeral Home. And he had been doing it since 1912 by himself, but he had opened the funeral home aspect in the 1930s, and he would merge with Hairston in 1949. Then there's an Allen Funeral Home, which opens up a couple doors down from Hairston/Watkins. And they were only open from 1940 to 1974. To put it in perspective where they were, this is the Harrison Funeral Home and Chapel building that still stands today. And if you drive down Fayette, this is now a parking lot. But you all may remember these buildings being there about 15 years ago or so. But that's where the Allen Funeral Home was, right here. Harrison Funeral Home has been there since 1949. It's Reginald Hairston was the founder of the Hairston Funeral Home. And they're obviously still in operation. Other African American funeral homes that have popped up in and around Martinsville and Henry County: Martinsville Funeral Home, Pritchett Funeral Home, Stanfield Miller. It's probably one of the more recent ones. Stanfield Miller was, until they closed, right there on Market Street across the corner from like NCI. They were in that building right there. And then Hines Funeral Home is one that is still existing, though not as popular as Harrison. They're on Starling over there near the fire station. Roselawn started as a burial park in the 1930s. Here's an ad where it says a new burial park is being prepped for Martinsville, and the date on that is 1930. Originally, it was 25 acres, but they had planned to expand it to 55, but they later scrapped those plans. All of those back up there, save for future development. But today, the parcel stands at 25 acres. But we see the burial park come in the 1930s. It was named in a naming contest. Local citizens could submit the name of what they wanted the burial park to be, and Roselawn was the selected name. In 1974, it becomes Roselawn Funeral Home, and it becomes the first burial park funeral home combo in the state. And it held that designation until the last couple of years. There was one opened up in Spotsylvania or Fredericksburg area, and then recently one opened up in Roanoke. But for close to 50 years, Roselawn was the only burial park funeral home combo in the state, which I thought was pretty neat. This is an ad from their opening in '74, and there's a modern day picture of it. Tomlinson Funeral Home. Tomlinson operated out of the Ridgeway area in the 80s. And the business, or Tomlinson, briefly came into Bassett with the Mize family. And Tomlinson sold the business, and it later became Funeral Services of Ridgeway, or I forget the name of it. But that building still exists right there behind the old Crest Star Bank, just off 220 in Ridgeway. Norris Funeral Home opens in 1996 here in Martinsville. Fun fact about that, you all know where Norris is, right there on Kings Mountain. That was not the original location that Norris wanted to move to. Norris wanted to open up here in Bassett, but he decided that the Collins home here on Main Street would need too much work. It would cost too much for him to move in, so he moved into Dr. Bessler's house on Kings Mountain Road in Martinsville. So that's how Norris got to be there. But they have since grown out and are now 7 different locations all across South Side and Southwest Virginia, from Danville all the way to Pulaski now. Then Wright Funeral Home. Tony Wright worked for Collins McKee for years, and then opened up his own funeral home in 2011. He now has 2 locations as of the last few months, and he also owns and operates the Fairhaven Memorial Park, which is on 58 heading towards Stewart.
Where's his second location?
Here in Bassett.
Bassett.
Yeah, he bought the country club in Bassett.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah. And then finally, last but not least, Bassett Funeral Service. Bassett Funeral Services opens their doors in July 1996 with Darrell Martin and Paul Kennedy as owners. They opened in originally the former Collins/Stone/Mize house, and then later in 2006, I think, they moved. They build their South Chapel, they call it, and move into what we now know as the larger funeral home that we see when we drive up and down today. That was 2006. Okay, I am done talking. I want to give special thanks to these people who allowed me to pick their brains for a while, and for Paul especially, because Paul Kennedy from Bassett Funeral Service gave me this stuff up here to display. So if you want to come look at it when you leave, I got a show burial vault up here, one that was carried around by salesmen to different funeral homes to show you what the vault would look like. A couple bottles of embalming fluid up here, and I'll glad to tell you about them. And then Andy back there was my sounding board for a lot of this stuff, and I know he's probably sick of hearing me talk about funeral stuff. So we're done. We're done. But any questions so far? Or any questions? I know I went through a lot of things at a breakneck speed, but yeah.
I've never understood in wars how they all got to a federal cemetery when they died all over the place.
They would be buried somewhere temporarily, and then marked. Like they would either put like the dog tags up or some sort of metal placard that this person was buried here, and if it's a foreign land, U.S. soldier or whatever, and then they would later reinter those. A good example of that would be what happened here in Martinsville with the 5 soldiers who were killed at the skirmish at Jones Creek. They were buried at either the cemetery or at the Episcopal Church right there on the corner, or in the backyard of Dr. James Moss Smith, which depending on what source you read. But then they were later interred in Danville, so we know who they were, and they would later move them.
The ones like over in Europe, they weren't embalmed or put in caskets. Or
most of them weren't, no. Or maybe a makeshift casket, but just a simple pine box, whatever they could put together quick. But you're right, they would just a lot of times take the bones and do it. And when I was talking to Bill Collins Jr. about this, he said that he'd worked with VDOT for years, and if they were ever building a road or and came across bones, they would take the bones they would find and then reinter them somewhere. So a lot of it's probably that they would just take what they could find. Yes, ma'am.
These sarcophagus or either the coffins.
Mm-hmm.
Were they the opening that you suggested they opened up? Did they have glass in them?
Yes, it was a glass covering there. Yeah, they would. Let's see if I'll go back way back. But yeah, it was a metal plate that you could screw on and screw off, but there was a glass covering right there, so you weren't exposed to the body itself. Any more questions? So, last thing I'll tell you. Does anybody have any guesses as to what this picture is right here? This is one of the most recent acquisitions at the Simpson Funeral Museum. This is an Orthodox Jewish casket. Now, what makes an Orthodox Jewish casket? There is no metal in it. Everything is put together with dowel rods and glue because Jewish custom is they want ashes to ashes, dust to dust, and that can't happen if there's metal. So that is it looks like just a simple, put together pine box, but that is what an Orthodox Jewish casket would look like even to this day. Put together, like I said, you can see some dowel rods and stuff right there. But everything would be totally biodegradable.
I found out that Muslims don't believe in cremation.
And
The Jews?
Jews, they don't, but I think a lot of religions, they're becoming more lax on that because, up in the Catholic Church, it was strictly prohibited until 63, and now it's taken off. I will say that I've heard of Orthodox Jews being cremated before. So I don't know if they had a convention to change that but it has happened. Yeah.
I was just going to tell you, a funny, scary story. In the theater, when you need to have a casket on stage, we can't afford a casket, but the way that they transport bodies from the hospital to the funeral home is in a casket,
Mm-hmm.
and you can buy a used casket for much less. And so if you go see a play and there's a casket on stage, it's most likely being used.
Used casket. Also, to add to that, you can also buy caskets from Walmart.
Oh my God.
You can go on the Walmart app and purchase a casket online and have it shipped to your house. So, I guess from birth to death.
There was some grave sites at Fieldale where they removed the big fence there that moved up the school the racer grave. And they were stuck over in the woods, and when you didn't get in the actual grave site, they were stuck up there out in the woods from it. So I used to there to dip in the ground with the word. No one's ever marked after the school.
That's interesting. Yes, ma'am.
Jared, did you look into any of the customs from the older days, like when my parents were young, that they sat up with the body every night?
I did kind of.
That's why it's called a wake.
Yeah, and she
They did wake up.
yeah they explained it better than I could. That there would always be somebody with the body, either family or the undertaker, and in case of the wake. But also it goes back to that sense of just being with somebody, too, and especially back in the older days, burial happened within a day or two tops of death. So these are going to be your last moments. So you would want to spend as much time as you could. I mean, now we have the ability to embalm people or, keep people in from burial for days, weeks, possibly months, depending on how long it takes family to come in.
Well, in Europe, there were someone that did wake up. They were not dead. But within the casket, they did wake up with death already.
and of course, you have the bell system, right, with the with the string and the bells. Yeah. Also, speaking of Europe and stuff, in Europe, you actually rent your space if you're buried. You're buried and you rent that space for 3 to 5 years, and then after 3 to 5 years, you're exhumed, and then your body or your family has to decide what to do because they're running out of space to bury people.
That's true in California, some parts too.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Well, in New Orleans.
Yeah,
They
and
bury on top of
yeah,
it.
in New Orleans they can't dig graves, and even locally, some of the local burial parks are starting to offer double stacked graves. So, if you and your spouse or a loved one want to buy a double stacked grave, they'll bury the first one 13 feet down and the next one 6, but it's the same plot, in order just to save space.
It's a big hole.
It is. Well, if that's all, thank y'all for letting me talk to y'all. I'll be glad to answer more questions at the end.